I am just beyond grateful to be here with everybody today. It's the beginning of October, and this is a really important month for those of you who are involved in literacy. And we want to recognize that October is Dyslexia Awareness Month, and that works out really well given our topics today, because I am going to be spending just a little bit of time talking about dyslexia. Many of the adults that we work with that have a background in English and have been through our school systems, that are continuing to be struggling readers, might be struggling with issues of dyslexia. And so it's important to have some of the basic skills and understanding of this disorder and this disability, so you can best serve those adults as you are working with them. As Bev mentioned, I am a former reading specialist. I got started in education as a K through 6 reading specialist in the LA area. And after doing that for about 6 years, I went back and I got a second teaching credential as an education specialist, which in the state of California allows you to then become a special education teacher. So I spent a decade being the special education English language arts instructor for primarily high school students. And so I was working with the majority of students in my classes in special education were there because they were struggling to read. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move through the presentation today. I want to just invite everybody to, as we mentioned earlier, use the chat function. I'm seeing some names popping up that I recognize as people are continuing to come in to our session. If you want to take an opportunity and introduce yourself in the chat, it can be sometimes very hard to network in this space. So please feel free to, reach out to somebody, a name, if you recognize it, say hello. I'd also like to invite everybody right now to raise your hand if your camera is on, or you can raise your hand virtually. If you have been working in the adult education space for more than a year. Let's also raise your hand if you support learners with disabilities, as far as you know. Working with learners with disabilities. Raise your hand if your program has multilingual learners that you're supporting. I'm seeing these numbers just go up. Great. Raise your hand if you have generally focused on reading strategies and comprehension during your time working with adults while you're supporting these skills. Are we leaning into the strategies of reading and comprehension? Go ahead and raise your hand if you don't feel as knowledgeable as you would like to about providing effective reading instruction. Excellent. Thanks for everybody who is participating. So what I'd like to invite everybody to do is, during our session today, feel free to jot down some aha moments. I've got some natural breaks built into the information I'm going to be sharing. You'll see the icons up at the top here with the comment icons, and that's going to be moments where I'm inviting you to either in the chat. I think we should probably keep it in the chat just based on the number of people that we've got coming in today, which is excellent. But you can then share that with your colleagues here in this space. So go ahead and make sure that if something's really resonating with you, jot it down. And then we're going to have moments where we can come together as a group as I'm moving through our topics, and you can share those aha takeaways, because it's likely that you're not alone, or maybe somebody has really reached out into something, has focused on something that was said that you are also going to be able to relate with. Okay, so let's look at adult literacy by the numbers. So if you are working in this space, you are aware that there's a considerable need for support. But many of us in this space don't know the hard, cold statistics. In the United States, 54% of all adults are reading below basic level. And 19% of high school graduates read below basic level. And we know that not everybody that goes to high school ultimately graduates from high school. What really stands out in the world of adult statistics for me is that when we look at equity and we look through a social justice lens at literacy, 70% of adults that are inmates in prison read below a basic level. And so that is going to speak to ability to access our communities, access employment. It really begins to affect the outcome of our adults in terms of having a life that is one of growth, one of happiness, one of being a functioning member of the community that you are coming from. And reading skills really are the key to unlocking the access that we see. And when we look at the percentage of those who are incarcerated in terms of identified learning disabilities such as dyslexia, we see the rate for that is much higher. We'll be talking about this in more detail in just a few minutes, but we know that roughly 1 in 5 individuals suffers from elements of dyslexia. So that equates to 20%. And that's not just for people that are speaking English. These are all human beings. 1 in 5 human beings is going to struggle with reading skills because of a neurobiological disorder that is dyslexia. And again, we'll unpack that in just a little bit, but wanting to just look at this a little more closely through this social justice lens and really highlight the importance of the work that you're doing in terms of supporting adults with literacy skills, we can see the vast numbers of dyslexia and reading difficulties represented in our prison populations. This is looking at Louisiana specifically, but we find these numbers to be consistent throughout the country. So again, when it comes to importance and significance of the work that you're doing in the adult literacy space, it's clearly second to none. It is of high value to everybody. The adult themselves, the community, the broader community surrounding the adult, it's very important work. So let's get into this. What is reading? When we talk about supporting adults with reading skills, what are we talking about? What do we mean when we say reading? Well, reading is a really complex process. It involves several different elements. You have to be able to look at a word in print and recognize the word. You have to be able to attach meaning to the word. You have to be able to move through multiple words to get to larger concepts. And you have to have the motivation to persevere through learning these skills to become proficient at it. And this all becomes really complex. We talk about the science of reading quite a bit. It's one of the hot terms in education these days because of the significance. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the science of reading and what it means. So I'm just going to norm some of my language here. When I talk about the science of reading, what I'm talking about is a vast body of research that is going to lend itself to educators selecting a process and a methodology for providing instruction that we know is proven to be effective for our learners. So it's not going to be you're doing things by gut, you think it's working. We're going to employ strategies and instructional processes that we know from evidence and research has been proven to work. And in the year 2000, Congress asked a group of educators and researchers to get together and determine what are the foundational skills involved in effective reading. And the group, which we call the National Reading Panel, came back with this model. We call this the reading pyramid. Other people will refer to it as the Big Five, but you can see the elements that are involved in proficient reading. And In the adult space, what we will do is we'll do sort of a reverse investigation. And that's valid when we're looking at why we see an adult struggling at this top level. Comprehension. We're not able to respond to questions correctly or effectively. Why is that? Well, is it because we're struggling with vocabulary? If it's not vocabulary, is that because of fluency? If we realize we're struggling with fluency, is that because of phonics and decoding? If we can't get into phonics and decoding, is it because of phonemic awareness? And I want to zero in here for just a second on this bottom level of our reading pyramid. We tend to think of working with adults and older learners, and we will primarily focus on these top 2 or 3 skills: the comprehension, the vocabulary, and the fluency. But if you have an adult that is struggling to connect a letter or a symbol that we call letters to a sound that we use in oral language, then we're really talking about phonemic awareness. And I'm going to zoom in on this in just a second. We know how the brain learns to read through the science of reading, and reading is a very new invention. Reading's not natural. It's not organic. Humans have invented this process, and I believe that's one of the reasons we see so many people struggling with this skill. It's not natural, but all around the world, we know that the brain is naturally wired for speech. So through repeated exposure to speech, a human being is naturally going to pick up the ability to comprehend and respond to the spoken language systems that they are surrounded by. When we're talking about reading, we're also now asking our brains to engage in the visual system. And so it becomes a more complex process. And when we talk about written language, we're really talking about the code for our oral language. And that's all reading is it is our oral language put down in symbols and in code so that our thoughts can be shared, our ideas can be shared, we can keep track of things, going all the way back to, the businesses and things like that, merchants, traders, back when humans were really migrating all over the planet. And that's one of the reasons why we had to come up with this process of reading. And so long after we're gone or when we're not there, we can continue to communicate our ideas with others. This is a very hot model right now, and I really like it as a way to root my instructional practice when I'm working with literacy skills with a student. It's called The Simple View of Reading. It was created by Goff and Tumner. It can become very complex as we get into these individual systems. I like this initial view of it because it's highlighting the fact that in order for an individual to read for meaning, what we have to do is we have to look at 2 primary skills: the ability to decode the text that they are looking at and connect meaning to what they are decoding. So first step is, can you understand the symbols that you're looking at? Do those symbols have meaning to you? And then can you apply meaning to those symbols? And this is a multiplication problem. These 2 elements are a product of one another. They're not a sum. And I'm going to give you an example here to kind of make this a little bit more digestible. I'm originally from a really small town in Indiana, and at my high school, we happened to have a Japanese instructor. And so all through high school, I took Japanese as my foreign language. And so I am still to this day able to decode Japanese. And it sounds really good. I can read it out loud. It's people say, oh, Jody-san, eat us. That's very good. I can no longer tell you what those words I am decoding mean. I can't connect any meaning to what I'm decoding. So 1 times 0 is still going to be 0. I can't read for meaning in Japanese because one of my critical skills here is not sufficient. Now, what we're working with oftentimes in the adult literacy space is most of our adults have the language skills. They come into us with language skills if we're working with adults that have a background in the English language, or we're working with adults that, you know, have some or varying degrees of background in the English language. You're going to have a different mathematical formula here, but 0 times 1 is always going to be 0. Just like if you're working with an English language learner, maybe you have 0 times 0.25 or 0 times 0.1. What you're going to get in terms of ability to read for meaning is a direct result of our skills in these 2 critical areas. And so again, I really appreciate this model. Now, let's zoom in a little bit on the skills we were just talking about there, in terms of our ability to recognize words and decode, and our language comprehension skills. You can see there are sub-skills built in here. And this is Scarborough's reading rope. This is one of the big models that everybody is talking about in terms of understanding how to provide effective literacy instruction. And I appreciate this because you get a sense of just how complex all of this is. And again, this is why we can see so many adults that struggle in this space. There's a lot going on here. Now, in order to access these upper level language comprehension skills, if you're looking at something in print, you have to have automaticity in these lower level word recognition skills. And so you have to be able to look at a word, recognize it, and then you can get into these upper level language comprehension skills where you're attaching meaning, where you're looking at how language is being used. For example, in English, we use a lot of irony and figurative language. And so we want our learners' brains to have enough energy left over after they've recognized a word that they can then become increasingly strategic about thinking how the language is being used. What we tend to find in the work we're doing in terms of literacy instruction is that down here in these word recognition skills, we do not have automaticity. And so our learners are spending all of their energy trying to decode words. And because they're exhausted after they decode a word, they can't become strategic in thinking about how words are being used. And that's the big takeaway here. Zeroing in further on this, because again, this is this critical part of our reading pyramid. Remember, that bottom foundational layer is phonological awareness. And one of the big mistakes we make in working with adults is thinking they are too old to have some instruction in this area. There is never a learner that we're working with that is beyond, in terms of age, the need to make sure these skills are shored up. So we want to make sure that our learners can get all the way down to individual sounds that we make in English and connect those sounds to the letters or these symbols that represent them. I'm going to open up the chat right here. Who can tell me how many phonemes or individual sounds are there in the English language? Go ahead and put it in the chat if you want to take a crack at this. And if somebody, as I mentioned, I'm seeing some familiar names in our group today. If somebody has already spent some time with me, go ahead and blow us out of the water with this. How many phonemes are there in the English language? Take a guess. I'm seeing some thoughts come in. Okay, great. We're doing awesome out there. Yes, there are about 44 phonemes in the English language. And some of that can depend on dialect and where you are in the United States. But we're tending to agree in this science of reading community these days that there are 44 primary phonemes in the English language. And we have to make sure we're providing instruction to our struggling readers so they are able to hear these sounds, and because they can hear them and they're familiar with them, they can then connect these sounds to the letters that the sounds represent. Let's read this sentence together, and this is going to really highlight the value of this work. Finished files are the result of years of scientific study combined with the experience of years. Don't worry about the overall meaning of this sentence. This is an exercise. I want you now in the chat, go ahead and tell me how many F's are used in this sentence. How many F's are in this sentence? And I'm not going to give you any more direction than that. How many F's are in this sentence? Go ahead and put it in the chat. Or think it to yourself. You see, I know the first time I did this activity, I saw 3 F's. I was shown how many F's there actually are in this sentence. And there are 6 F's in the sentence. The reason our brains do not automatically see all 6 of these F's is because we have F in the word of. And in the word of, which is a high frequency word in the English language, the letter F is not representing the traditional sound that we associate it with. It actually, in the word of, is spelling v. So here it's just an exercise to really highlight the importance of teaching these phonemes and the symbols that represent the phonemes, because if we don't, how is a struggling reader really going to connect that this word is pronounced of and isn't being replaced in their brain with the word off, which would completely change the meaning of this sentence for a struggling reader? Which is why, of course, a struggling reader would not be able to ever answer a comprehension question correctly if they're replacing of with off when they see this word in print. Here's a moment, a built-in moment here. Anybody want to share in the chat a takeaway or a thought that they have had? Okay, great. I'm getting some comments. Bev is chiming in here about teaching to automaticity. Yes, absolutely. She's elaborating on the cognitive resources piece. Any other takeaways or thoughts you want to share? Go ahead and put it in the chat. Write down something that struck you in the information that we just covered. Please feel free to do so. Had a lot of good responses there with our activity. Thank you, everybody, for your participation here. Okay, now we know that in terms of reading proficiency, good readers will become great readers, and poor readers will remain poor readers. And this is what we call the Matthew effect. And if you look to the left of this graphic, you'll see that initially, when we're first learning these reading skills, the gap between the good readers and the poor readers is not that wide. But as time goes on, look at how wide that gap becomes. And again, this is speaking to issues of equity and access in our communities. As we see these gaps really expand, we know that there are real life implications that come with this. It comes with employment. It comes with accessing services, you name it. Checking your kid in at the hospital if they're sick and you get handed a form you've got to fill out, right? There are all kinds of issues that come for our adults who struggle with reading. And so one of the reasons that we have to make sure we're addressing this is that we're closing that gap. Now, there can be lots of factors that impact an adult's ability to read. When I first started teaching, my master teacher was explaining to me that when she was in 2nd grade, they thought that she was cognitively impaired. And they had asked her to repeat 2nd grade, and her father was in the Army. They were moving quite a bit. So she was going to a bunch of different schools. Of course, that wasn't helping things, but she finally had a teacher who noticed that she was always sitting in the front of the room. My master teacher was as a small kid, and was squinting a lot. And so they checked her eyesight, and it turned out that there was nothing cognitively impaired with this woman. It was that she was almost legally blind, and she couldn't see the work that was being presented and what was happening on the board in the classroom. And this amazing teacher, she was explaining to me that she just thought that was how the world looked to everybody. She didn't know that there was anything wrong with that. So there can be a lot of elements that can impact somebody's ability to work in the literacy space. One of the libraries I've been speaking with recently was sharing a story the other day to me about how they're working with a student who is unable to repeat a word back after a word is said out loud. And so, there are all kinds of language processing issues that can impede somebody's ability to access literacy skills and be able to decode words in print. I want to talk for just a second about learning disabilities. Now, I do have a background as a high school special education teacher, so I think this is also really important when we're working with adults who we know have been in our school systems but still struggle. When we look at the numbers across the United States, roughly 50% of all individuals that have qualified for special education services in our school system are there because they have an SLD, or a specific learning disability. And that's going to encompass several different language processing issues, dyslexia being one of them. When we look at those SLD students, 85% of them are really going to struggle with areas of dyslexia and the language processing component. So why do we not know more about these areas of deficit and how to work with these individuals? And I think this is another blind spot, and it's important if you're working in the adult literacy space, because you will have adults coming in for support, whether they have a background in English or not, that are going to be struggling with specific learning disabilities or reading difficulties. Now, there are really 4 types of reading difficulties that we talk about in the literacy world. If you think back to the simple view of reading here, our Goff and Tumner, where it was, our multiplication problem, a proficient reader is going to have strong skills in both word reading, so being able to decode words, look at them and recognize them quickly and automatically. And they're going to also be strong with their language comprehension skills. They're going to have very strong verbal skills, etc. They're going to be able to connect what they read to their oral language centers in the brain, and then they're going to be able to move through a text. When we move down from our proficient readers, you're looking at a dyslexic or compensating learner, and that's somebody who is going to be weak with their ability to see a word in print and recognize it quickly and automatically. But this individual has very strong language comprehension skills. And that's one of the reasons why our dyslexic students can be very challenging to identify, is they present very strong in terms of their oral language skills. And so part of a dyslexia diagnosis or an SLD diagnosis in special education is going to be the discrepancy that we see there. They're going to perform much more poorly in terms of reading skills than we would expect them to, based on their cognitive abilities and their oral language abilities. And then we move to the right, and we've got mixed reading difficulty, where we're weak in both those areas. And then slightly above that, we have the hyperlexic, which would somewhat represent me if I were reading Japanese, because I can decode with strength, but I can't connect meaning to what I'm decoding. And the hyperlexic student that you may see in the adult library environment is going to be an adult who can read, but cannot connect any meaning to what they're reading. And oftentimes, an adult that you might see demonstrating those skills, there could be several things going on with them, but one of the things to think about is they could be an adult struggling with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. That tends to be a student that we see with hyperlexia in the special education setting. They've zeroed in on the code that exists in the English language. They can read with proficiency, but they can't connect meaning to the language they're decoding. So now, talking about dyslexia just in a little bit more detail, according to the International Dyslexia Association, dyslexia is a specific learning disability, and it's neurobiological in origin. And so you're born with it. And much like autism spectrum disorder, you're always going to have it. What our goal is to provide learners with strategies and skills where they can compensate for this disability. We can overcome incredible obstacles by teaching skills and having repeated exposure to strategies that we know are effective. I'm not going to read the definition out to you. Hopefully you're reading that on your own, but it does mention in here that part of the diagnosis of dyslexia is, again, that discrepancy with what they can do in terms of reading print versus their overall cognitive ability. There is something off in how we see that dyslexic individual presenting with reading skills versus other skills they possess. And that's really important because we tend to talk about dyslexia as being a hidden disability. People will mask this disability to a great extent. I'll share a story in just a moment, but we come down really hard in our K through 12 school systems on students who present as being highly functioning and smart and capable, but then they struggle to read. We will attach labels to them in terms of, being lazy, you're not trying hard enough, you don't care, etc. And I bring this up because the adults, if they are struggling or have struggled with dyslexia and they're brave enough to come into the library to ask for help, they have been through a lot. And that's important for you to keep in mind as you're working with them. We know that students and learners who have struggled with dyslexia in our K through 12 school systems, in a sense, have gone through repeated trauma on a day-to-day basis. And it might explain why a K through 12 student ultimately just stops going to school and does not get a high school diploma, because the trauma that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis is just too great, and they have to preserve their emotional framework and their sense of self. So now they avoid the space that is causing them so much frustration, anger, confusion, lack of sense of self. I'm going to pause there. I can go much deeper into this particular topic, but just want to give people an opportunity now. Share a thought, write a thought down on this. Is there something you would like to know more about in terms of this particular topic? And again, you are going to be working with these adult learners, if you haven't already, that are struggling with these types of specific learning disabilities. And so that's why I think there's a lot of value in just some basic understanding of the background of that learner as they're coming in and seeking help in the library setting.
Jody, I just quickly wanted to share that my twin sister, thanks to the counselor and my mother, was discovered to have been dyslexic in high school, and then she became our valedictorian.
Yes. Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. Because dyslexia is in no way connected to your cognitive ability. In fact, that's part of the diagnosis. And thank you for that. And those of you, it was a little muffled, but I believe it was Bridget was saying that she has a twin sister or sister that was diagnosed with dyslexia in high school, but was the valedictorian. And one of the earliest recorded examples of dyslexia that we have through medical journals is something that was written in a British medical journal in the, I think, late 1800s. And one of the physicians was working with this young man who could not read. And the physician's notes read something along the lines of, if school were entirely oral, this kid would be the number one student in the entire school. But because school involves all of this reading and print, this kid is really struggling. And the doctor was very confounded by this particular student that he was asked to help. And as a special education high school teacher, former sped high school teacher, part of what we will do to compensate and help these students is we'll turn our classrooms into oral language classrooms where we will read with or for the student. And we tend to not spend enough time giving the students skills they need to read independently, which is why they can leave our K through 12 setting and have very low reading skills and proficiency in that area. And that's why you might be seeing them walk through the doors of your library. So thank you very much for that contribution.
Hi, Jody. This is Betty Bogart.
Betty, okay. Yes. Hi, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry it wasn't clear, but that was my twin sister. Yeah.
Your twin sister. Okay. Wow. What an amazing story. And I'm sure there are many of those out there to share. And, yes. And whether it's a relative or, you know, just somebody that you've worked with, that you have seen them compensate for these deficits that they have, it's really remarkable. I know Tom Cruise is somebody who has been very outspoken about the fact that he is dyslexic and he struggles with reading. And at the beginning of his career, he couldn't go into any auditions and be handed a script. He had to have that script beforehand, and he would have somebody read it to him. He would memorize it. He would go into the audition and he would hold the script in his hand and look at it and pretend that he was reading, when in fact he wasn't, because he didn't have those skills. So it is amazing some of the strategies that people can put in place to compensate for these deficits in reading. And again, though, if you're getting somebody who is asking for help, it's just so great that you're there to provide that support so they can be independent, because you can teach even a severely dyslexic learner the skills so they can read with proficiency. And that's going to look different for everybody. But the way we're going to do that, the way we're going to provide the instruction, is through a structured literacy model. And structured literacy is a framework of instruction that was created by the International Dyslexia Association. But what I like about it, and what I use it for in the work that I'm doing now, is it works for everybody. And on the outside of what I call the literacy wheel, you've got how you're going to teach. And on the inside of the literacy wheel, you have what you need to teach. And a lot of these skills that you're teaching on the inside of the literacy wheel, they actually directly correlate to the reading pyramid, to Scarborough's rope. So again, this is all part of the science of reading. These are the proven effective strategies for providing great literacy instruction. What we need to make sure that we are doing when we are working with struggling readers, or even new readers, if you've got somebody coming into the library who just needs help learning how to read in English and they don't have a learning disability, you still want to be very explicit and direct with what you are working with them on. You're going to be clear. We're not leaving things up to discovery. We're just going to show them what they need to know. And we're going to move from simple to more complex in terms of the skills that we're teaching. We want to make sure that as we're providing instruction, we're spiraling back on previously taught skills so our learners can maintain mastery of those skills, because our brains do have data dumps. And so if we're not using something, our brain might delete it to make room for more information. So spiraling back is really important. And we're going to make sure we know if our students and our learners are maintaining mastery, because they're going to show us that they can demonstrate these skills and use these skills repeatedly. So we're going to be diagnostic. We're going to make sure they have maintained mastery before we pile on and start adding new things into the mix. So brief overview of a more intricate framework for a lesson. I want to show you now, what does this look like when you're working with students? How might this look? So what can you do? I recommend, when you are working with adults, or anybody for that matter, who is learning to read or is working on these skills, focus on the patterns that exist in the English language. And there are patterns that exist. Roughly 84% of all the words we use in English print systems do follow a pattern and are decodable. It's just that we don't know what that pattern is. I like to use a marking system to help students have visual reference for what they're doing. It also is really helpful as you're working and getting into multisyllabic words and we're breaking words up into individual syllables. If you use a marking system, the student can recall what they decided they were doing in previous syllables when they go to put it all together and sound that word out. And if you've ever worked with a dyslexic student, you'll notice that even if they are able to accurately move through a multisyllabic word and sound out the syllables individually, by the time they go back to put it all together, oftentimes they can't remember what they had decided for syllable one, right? What is that vowel sound? What did I decide? And that's where you'll see frustration and where you'll see people stop showing up for instruction, because dyslexic students also have very poor working memories when it comes to language processing skills and things like that. And they're doing research on that, and we can talk about that later. But here's an example of a pattern that exists in the English language. Does anybody know why in English the word cat is spelled with a C, but kitten is spelled with a K, even though the beginning sound of both words is? Why do we spell with a C when we're saying cat, but we spell with a K when we're saying kitten? Why two different spellings for that one sound? And I see, give you a second to think about that. It's in the vowel. Yes, excellent. Thank you. So let's look at these words. Kit, kid, the name Ken, can, caught, cup. What do you notice about the vowels? And I'm going to use a mark and I'm going to put an X under the vowel, and I'm training my brain to zero in on where the vowels live in the words, because when we're working with struggling readers, it is the vowels that will give them the toughest time, because our vowels make so many different sounds. I saw a comment in the chat box earlier about that. And our 5 vowels make over 14 different sounds in the English language. So this is where we can see a lot of frustration for our readers. So you can see here that when we're talking about our vowel sounds, K, we're using K to spell K if the vowel sound that follows it is the short I, or the short E, eh. So if the vowel sound following K is or we spell the K with a K. If the vowel sound following K is short vowel A, short vowel O, or short vowel U, we spell the K with a C. And you maybe noticed that I was doing some little movements. We can also bring multisensory instruction into our work with struggling readers, and we can provide what I refer to as little kinesthetic cues, like the short vowel I, like you have an itch, the short vowel O, like you're singing in an opera, or what letter is my mouth making when I make sound, or the vowel, like pick me up, what letter are my arms making? So there are all these other little cues and things that you can bring into your instruction that will really help your learners digest and be able to recall these short vowel sounds. And we lean into short vowel sounds in instruction because we use short vowels more than any other vowels in the English language. So an example of a pattern that exists is our K takes I and E, C takes the other 3, right? You know, and that's kind of fun. You can play games with that as you're working with your learners. But how do we determine whether vowel sounds are short or long? So I'm going to mark my vowel, and I'm going to look at what comes after the vowel. If it's one consonant, I'm going to call it a guardian. consonant, I'm going to put a little star above it, and I can explain to one of my learners that a guardian consonant has a job, just like a guardian in real life has a job, and that's to protect something short, someone shorter. In this case, a guardian consonant's job is to protect a short vowel sound. And that's why this word is pronounced met. We can build off of this skill, and we can go to another skill where I'm marking my vowel and I'm looking at what comes after it. And now I see two consonants that are there, and two consonants are also guardians. And because they're guardians, what are they protecting? Is this vowel going to be short or long? It's going to be short. And that's why this word is pronounced jump. And those are the only two patterns you need to teach students for identifying a short vowel sound in print in English. And again, we use short vowels more frequently than any other vowel sound. I can now get into long vowel sounds. Remember, we're systematic, so I'm going from simple to complex. The vowel in this word is at the end. There's no other vowels before it. There are no consonants that follow it, so it is long. There aren't a ton of words like this in the English language, he, she, and go, but this is one of the most common syllable types in English. So that becomes very important later. And you can see how we can apply these patterns that we're teaching, and we can get into multisyllabic words. One letter in the English language can completely change how the vowel in the word is pronounced. So we've got other patterns we can teach. Just two additional patterns will help us with words of any length or syllabication. And here is a word with two working vowel sounds in it. So it's a two-syllable word. Syllables are determined by the number of working vowel sounds. For every working vowel sound, you have a separate syllable. But where can I break this word up? I'm going to look at what is between my marked vowels. And if it is just one consonant, I've got a rule that I can follow, and that is one must run. So the T is going to run to the second syllable. And now I know where I can break this word up and look at each individual syllable. And because I can look at it as an individual syllable, I can now plug in one of my previously taught patterns. And again, this is systematic instruction. This is cumulative instruction because we're consistently utilizing previously taught skills. And this can be very fun for your adult learners. You can give them a word, ask them to spell it, then ask them to prove the vowel sounds in the word. And you don't want to move forward if you see a student struggle. Stay with them in that space. Give them plenty of practice opportunities. The last pattern you need to decode words of really any length or syllabication is after you've marked your vowels and you're looking at what's between those marked vowels. If it is more than one, the rule is two will split. So now I know where I can divide this multisyllabic word, and I can plug in one of my previously taught patterns. And you can see in this word campus, both syllables are following pattern one. And so you see how frequently those short vowel patterns will come up because we use short vowels so often in English. And it's a fun way to teach students. It's using really simple language to explain something that's actually much more complex. And what the marking system's doing is it's helping highlight patterns, providing a visual reference for students, and it's aiding in automaticity. And so the human brain is a pattern-loving organ. And if you've never noticed the arrow in the FedEx logo, I apologize, because you're never going to be able to unsee it now that you've seen it. But that's what you're doing with a simple marking system like the one I just showed you, is you're allowing the brain to really lock into the pattern that exists in the English language. And as we are learning and we're working towards automaticity, there are stages of learning. There's 3 stages of learning. There is the introduction, and the awareness of a skill. Then there's that awkward stage where you're practicing and you're really not sure what you're doing, and maybe you don't have a ton of confidence, but then it does become automatic. A new skill can become automatic. And this is me learning a new skill. I grew up, as I mentioned, in this small town in Indiana that just happens to have one of the best volleyball programs in the country. And they started my training when I was in first grade. I started playing volleyball in first grade, right? And I was very awkward and I was insecure. But, you know, moving through the years, we were having a lot of success. We were winning junior Olympic championships and getting awarded. And so it's like this with automaticity, with those three stages. Remember when you learned how to ride a bike, or if you don't know how to ride a bike, that's okay, but you understand the process of it. It typically starts with an adult explaining the bike to the kid. And, you know, it's like, here are the brakes, here are the pedals, this is how you steer. And then ultimately, you're helping this kid on the bike. You got to stand there. You got to make sure they don't fall. And this is a metaphor for the instruction that you can provide in literacy. You want to be there to help, because eventually, though, the goal is to be independent and automatic with these skills. And the same is true for anything that we're learning, whether it's riding a bicycle or driving a car, right? When you are first learning to drive a car, you do not just hop on the California freeway and head to the 101 405 interchange, right? Like, that would be terrifying. There are all these steps, but eventually you will get there. And so that's how I want you to really think about the literacy instruction that you're providing. Go ahead, and I'm going to pause here for a second. I know we've just got a couple minutes left. Thinking about anything that's really resonating with you, something that you think you could take into the work you're doing with adult literacy that we've just talked about. Jot it down, right? This is just a great opportunity to think about, how can I enhance the good work and the care that I'm already providing the adult learners that I'm working with. And let's just take this a little step further. We want to, as we are working with our adults, have them reading. We want them using the skills that we're teaching them in isolation and then generalizing that, and working with decodable text. So working with language that you know is following patterns that you've just been working with your learner on. That's going to be really helpful. Giving feedback as a learner is reading out loud is really helpful. And it's one of the reasons we want to make sure they are reading out loud to us. It's going to give us a sense of how they are hearing these sounds in their brain. I personally don't believe there is any such thing as silent reading. Just because I'm not saying it out loud, I'm still hearing it in my brain. And something I really like to use when I'm working with adults and older learners is poetry, because it's short and you can have some really interesting conversations and vocabulary development about the meaning of words and things like that. If you're working with a struggling reader and you give them a short passage, it's going to, I think, go a long way. I think reading is a lot like eating. We decide what sort of experience we're going to have initially with our eyes. So if you give somebody something very long to read, a long passage, and they struggle with reading, immediately they're going to get into some negative self-talk. I'm never going to get through this, you know, et cetera. So short passages are also really critical. And then you can build off of that. And finding the strengths of our learners, right? And again, you know, we know if we're working with adults that have been in our K through 12 systems, they maybe have some intense baggage and you know, just negative sense of self and negative self-talk that they might be bringing with them into sessions that they're doing with you. So figure out ways to play on your learner's strengths and you know, create that relationship and that alliance with the learner, because their motivation is going to be critical, because as an adult, they do not have to keep coming back. We know that motivation when we're working with older learners is almost that next tier on the reading pyramid. It's not like they have to report there every day. If they struggle, you know, we're not going to see them again. So we want to keep that motivation high and help them attain their goals, because if they're showing up for support, it's likely something is going on and in their life, and they have a goal, they have something they need to get done in the space, so you can help them do that. And you know, you can go from the stages of proficient readers and getting them into connected text. I don't know if you've ever read The Phantom Toll Booth, but it is full of figurative language. And so I find it to be really valuable, but we can get them through these stages into whatever their end goal was and whatever brought them into the library for instruction. And I know that, again, we just want to make sure that you are zeroing in on what their issues are. Think back to the National Reading Pyramid and you're looking at root cause. You know, don't spend time in an area that the learner does not need support with. Again, that will impact motivation. And ultimately, we want to increase their sense of self-efficacy, their feeling of I can do this, by reducing the perceived difficulty of the tasks that we're giving them. And so making sure that, again, the passages you're giving them to read, the materials you're working with, that it is at an appropriate skill level, and that it's at the appropriate lexile level, that the language is meeting where they are in terms of those two elements is really critical. And lastly, just creating and modeling that growth mindset and harnessing the power of yet. And you're going to have rough days in adult literacy. Your learners are going to have rough days, and maybe they didn't get it today, but let's make sure we're communicating to them. They just didn't get it yet. They will get it. You guys can do this. You're a great team. And I want to just thank everybody for your time today.